Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Well, hey, everyone, welcome in. We are continuing through the book of Revelation, and today is one of those exciting days where we get to bring on a guest. And this is actually a guest who we've already referenced in some areas, so this would be cool to actually get his voice on. But Rob, why don't you go ahead and give the bio?
We are excited to have what I think is one of the premier biblical scholars, especially when it comes to the book of Revelation. David deSilva is a New Testament scholar and a professor of New Testament and Greek at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ohio. He received his PhD in religion from Emory University, and he's authored a number of books and commentaries, including an introduction to the New Testament, context, methods, and ministry formation. He's written a commentary on Galatians and on Ephesians, and then these we'll put the links to in the show notes also, but Seeing Things John's Way, the Rhetoric of the book of Revelation, Unholy Allegiances, Heeding Revelation's Warning, which we want to recommend every one of you to pick up. Basically a commentary, right, David? Discovering Revelation is kind of Discovering Revelation, Context, Interpretation, and Reception. And then a wonderful book also that Vinnie and I have referred to this series along for a number of times called A Week in the Life of, and David wrote the book on A Week in the Life of Ephesus. So if you want to get a good background on what life was like in first century Ephesus, this is a wonderful, wonderful book. David is an ordained elder in the Florida Conference of the Global Methodist Church. And Vinnie, I've probably said this to you before, and I know David will be kind of whatever to say, but I'm going to say it anyways. But, you know, I meet a lot of scholars and whatever at these conferences and things like that, but there are some that are just really, really good people too. And David's in that category. He's just one of the really, really good people. So I'm sure he didn't appreciate me saying that necessarily, but it's wonderful to have you with us, David. Thank you so much for being with us.
Shucks, Rob.
You're welcome. So if we can start maybe just telling us a little bit more about your story, your family, how you got to where you are. You live in Florida, but you're working at a university in Ohio. Kind of fill us in a little bit on who David deSilva is.
Sure. And yes, thanks for having me on this podcast. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Revelation with you all. I am married, and Donna Jean and I have been married for coming up on 33 years.
All right.
August 4th. We are the parents of 3 grown children, all of them sons,
Nice.
all of them supporting themselves. I grew up Episcopalian, actually, and I fell in love with the liturgy and hymnody of the church at an early age, was drawn to God, was drawn to scripture. By the time I was 13, I was devouring the word, and I look to that as the turning point in my life with God, my commitment to Jesus, and the direction of my life. The 2 loves of my life, scripture and church music, came to me before I hit puberty, and they've been with me ever since. That's in a nutshell.
Well, we have a lot in common. I've been married 33, but going on 34 years.
Okay.
And we have 3 grown boys and 1 girl, and she's 20. So
The bonus child.
Yeah, the bonus child that came along later. Yeah.
But the discontinuity is Rob has 0 musical abilities.
Well, I wasn't going to say that. Yeah. My 2 loves are, my family and sports, right? But, I didn't want to sound like, I wasn't an academic here. So.
Hey, so David, one of the things that we always do when we get a guest on, when we talk about a book, and especially with Revelation, is we want to say, hey, give us a big picture in terms of how you see the book before we get into maybe some specific things. But what are some central themes or a theme that you see through the book? And just when you're teaching a class on this, which I'm sure you have in your context once or twice, like when you start off before you get into chapter 1, verse 1, what are the things that you're just giving people, that those goggles to look for?
Sure. I'd say one of the main things that John is trying to do through Revelation is just raise the question of what does God deserve? And how should we live in the midst of all the challenges and situations we find ourselves? How should we live in such a way that aligns our practice with what God deserves? So I know that's not probably a typical thing to come out with Revelation, but it seems from beginning to end, John's passion is for calling all people to honor and fear God, worship Him who made them, keep His commandments, keep the testimony of Jesus, give God His due. And from the negative side of all that, Revelation is the most outspoken book in the canon concerning what happens when you don't give God's due. And so, yeah. So I think that would be a major theme. I know it might be more fashionable to talk about, the victory of God in the end, or what have you, and that's all part of it. But I think John is really very much concerned with what his hearers are going to do tomorrow. And he wants to make sure that front and center in their mind is, I'm going to do what is just and right in God's sight, no matter what it costs. So in the end, that is the most honorable and advantageous thing for me to do.
Which is the Christian calling, isn't it?
I like to think so. Yeah.
Yeah. But easier said than done, too, I think, too. Also, excellent. Well, David, as we mentioned to you before we started today's show, that we just completed a study of the 7 messages, which I think you call the 7 oracles. And we kind of examined the Roman context. We went into some depth, I hope, on that with the imperial cult, and addressed some of the pressures that Christians were or may have been facing in the Roman world. And we wanted to bring you on to kind of go even deeper with that discussion. Obviously, we mentioned earlier that you wrote a book called A Week in the Life of Ephesus. You've lived in this world a little bit. So this is kind of an open question, but what can you tell us to help us understand further what life was like for the average person, and obviously the average Christian person in particular, and what the Christians were affected, what affected the Christians and how they were affected, and what John was addressing to them in light of that background. So that might be a lot. You can talk for 30 minutes if you need to, but fill us in, please.
That is a huge question.
Okay, good.
What was life like in the first century? Well,
in 50 words or less.
Yes, and it's sweet.
And you mentioned the imperial cults. Roman imperialism is, of course, very important. I want to be careful not to overemphasize any one thing, although I do think that's an important facet of their situation. I think one of the things that is true for most people in Roman Asia Minor, not the elites per se, but most people, life is fairly precarious. Life is not economically secure, and one needs to not rock one's network too much. One needs to keep one's social attachments and social circles and those networks of better placed friends that we like to call patrons, because you never know when you're going to need something because something didn't work out. And if anyway, so life is a bit precarious, and it's risky when there's nothing in the bank, as it were, where there's no job security, no typical safety nets in society that we're so used to. So when you step out and decide to associate yourself with an unpopular sect, that's risky. It's dangerous, and it carries real costs.
So you're talking about people then that live hand to mouth, day by day, no security for tomorrow.
Yes, exactly. The majority, I would say, of artisans, those who work lower down the pay scale in the shipping and trade industries, of course, every agricultural worker. And even though we talk about the 7 cities, the 7 cities are sustained by a host of agricultural workers living outside the cities, living in villages and the hinterlands of the cities. So yeah, like 95% of the population is in a precarious place.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
And so to suddenly paint a target on their foreheads, saying, I no longer, honor the gods that keep society going, like you do, it invites a lot of unwanted attention and Yeah. So I think that's,
and David, is that what you mean when you said they don't want to disrupt society? What you're meaning is by not giving allegiance to the gods that keep society going, it's not just a personal conviction, religious conviction. You're risking messing up just how society works in general.
Exactly. And losing that which gives you kind of a credit rating in the ancient world, being a reliable, honorable, pious person who pulls together with the rest of us to make sure that all of us get what we need. And we actually believe that the gods provide this, because as one persecutor famously said, we too are a pious people. We really believe this stuff for the most part. So the witness of early Christians becomes quite a challenge to their neighbors, one that is obviously, as the history of the church showed, not typically well received.
Wow, interesting. So when you're looking at the imperial cult, then this is something that's going to affect all of Rome and Rome's citizens and inhabitants. So from a Christian standpoint, then you have this issue of there's a new conviction, a new ethic for people who are following Israel's Messiah and the God of Israel. This is creating a major impact for those people, not just like as a personal crisis of conscience, but then just how they not just function within society, but actually live, like have their being within a systemic culture.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the God of Israel, because for the majority of folks in Ephesus or Pergamum or Smyrna, etc., the focus of attention is Rome, as you say. That's the center of the map. And the people in Asia Minor and the people in Italy actually share a great deal in terms of common culture and religion. They understand one another. They get us. to play on a modern slogan. But then we have a number of our neighbors here meeting together in pockets in people's houses, and they're suddenly shifting their attention to the tribal god of this subject people somewhere off there to the east. We're not exactly sure where. That's a foreign superstition making its way. It's a barbaric fringe superstition making its way into our midst and turning formerly good God-fearing people into members of some sort of cult. And not to make too much of just the imperial cult per se, but what is the hope of most of these people's neighbors? I believe that most of them really hope that Rome will last, and that good emperors, not the occasional nut job like Caligula or Nero, great case studies for why cousins shouldn't marry, but sensible emperors and sensible governors who will foster the conditions that allow our precarious lives to flourish predictably. Stability, peace, insurance against invasion or any of those things that are just terribly disruptive. And the only safety net for us, by the way, here in Ephesus, if there is a massive crop failure in Asia Minor, is the emperor and his machine for sending grain our way. So our hope is in him. That song that we used to sing in contemporary worship back in the 90s when this song was contemporary. Our hope is in you, Lord, is easily something that a lot of the Christians' neighbors in Ephesus could have sung to Vespasian and Titus and Domitian and meant it. So now I'm rambling. This is the danger.
No, that's great. That's great. No,
questions.
excellent. And what you're talking about too, right, is the idea that the gods are the ones who are really in control, but the gods have put the emperor in power to maintain that control and stability in the empire.
Excellent. And that's exactly kind of how Virgil, for example, in the Aeneid, wants Romans to think about it. The emperor and Augustus is practically named in the Aeneid. Or that wonderful inscription that I'm sure you've already talked about from Priene, the calendar inscription. Providence, divine providence has given the world Augustus to be the means by which order, stability will come to the whole world. So his birthday was the beginning of good news.
Right. I think we actually mentioned that in our study of the Gospel of Mark.
Mark, yeah.
When we open up the Gospel of Mark, because I think Mark's maybe alluding to that as this political statement in Mark 1:1. Now the Christians come along with the Jews, and they worship an invisible God who can't be seen, and they were accused of being atheists. So it was not only something that was anti-imperial, the religious fiber of the day, but it was something that didn't make sense to the people too, right? I mean, the Christian message, I'm saying, didn't make sense to the Roman neighbor, because who worships a God that can't be seen?
Yeah, I do wonder about that, because there are philosophical strains in Greek and Latin literature that talk about, the God who can't be depicted by these images that we have, and they're all just kind of the faces that we put on the one God who is beyond them all. But having said that,
with that, just curious on what you mean by that. Is that kind of like a Acts 17, like the unknown God, like maybe even alluding to like the great mathematician type idea God that can be unknown? Like, is that what you're referring to,
or just the one God of a Plato or an Aristotle, who is depicted, who is refracted poorly through our many ideas of the gods.
Interesting.
So there is this philosophical monotheism out there, but let's face it, who listens?
That didn't do Socrates too well either, though, right?
No, exactly right, and for the same reason, right? Because he denied ancient divinities and introduced new ones. So so that long disclaimer and rabbit aside, which might get edited out of this podcast.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, that's
good. I only added out things that Vinnie says when he talks about Al Davis and the Raiders.
The problem, of course, with Judaism, with Jews and their faith, is not that they believe in an invisible God, but they deny the existence of anyone else's gods. That's just antisocial. That's just mean. That's wrong. Because we're willing to make room for their God.
Oh yeah.
We're willing to make room for everyone's gods, because we're a tolerant and pluralistic religious society. But for anyone to come along and say, your gods are sticks and stones, but ours is real, no, that's not going to fly. And of course, the Christians inherit that faith tradition and embrace it wholeheartedly. Now, the three of us are all here in this podcast because we think they happen to have been correct.
Yeah, right.
But in the first century, that's really a strike against the piety that was widely regarded as the foundation of social order.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinedtruth.com and click on the Give tab, or follow the link in the show notes.
So on a daily basis or weekly basis or whatever, this is kind of a one-off question, but what are some ways in which this manifested itself in a regular daily life or routine of a week or a course of a month for a person in Ephesus who had just become a Christian and now they're confronted with this? What are some examples of ways in which this manifests itself, the conflict?
In large measure, it calls them to withdraw themselves from places that they naturally flocked to 2 weeks ago.
Such as?
and don't let me forget to come back to the Nicolaitans. Remind me.
All right, very good. That's on you, Vinnie.
So on the 23rd of the month, that's Augustus's birthday.
Okay.
Now, technically it's September, but it doesn't matter. He's Augustus. We celebrate it every 23rd of the month.
Oh.
So there's a religious festival. There are not weekly. There are monthly processions of Artemis through the city of Ephesus, where thousands of citizens come out to watch 100 or 200 priests and citizens participate in the procession of the sacred images and everything that goes along with it, the dancers, the musicians, the sacrifices.
It sounds like Mardi Gras.
Well,
like that's what I'm
except it's
picturing.
even better because it ends with free meat.
Right.
Who doesn't like free meat?
Right. Especially for
Who
people
doesn't
that
like
don't
a
eat meat.
potluck
Yeah.
at the end of the day, with bread, wine, and the meat from the sacrificial animals provided for all in a great fellowship meal that pulls the city together and reminds us of our civic unity. We don't go to that anymore. We don't get any of those anymore. When our patrons invite us to dinner, which is, a huge gift to us, and we don't go, or we show up late because we know they say grace, and we don't want to be part of that. We don't want to be part of the libations. And in some ways of thinking, once I pour out a little bit of the wine in honor of the gods, the rest of the wine is sacred to the gods. So I don't want to touch any of that. Trade guilds have patron deities. So am I going to show up late to every meeting? Am I not going to go at all? Am I going to risk my networks of fellow craftsmen, my business associates? Again, one of the few things that is formed to be a kind of social safety net.
That also impacts your business if you don't, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So there's a big economic reason to attend.
And people are going to start to notice that you don't show up anymore. We never see you at these functions. Why is that? What is
You're always sick
to
on
you?
the 23rd day of the month.
I know, right? What's up with that?
Like, I don't know. It's just weird how that happens.
And those who are elite are going to have difficulty maintaining their elite status, their influence, because they cannot participate in most of the fora in which elite people participate. I mean, religion is tied into everything in the first century. So some of the characters in that little novella that you mentioned, A Week in the Life of Ephesus, I tried to paint the picture of what it's like for an up-and-coming member of the elites to have to navigate holding on to faithful Christian witness and obedience in this polytheistic world, or what it's like for a merchant / trader to do so, what it's like for a slave in the household of a pagan householder to do so. And in every case, I mean, religion is so ubiquitous that to have strong convictions about abstaining from any worship but that of the God of Israel and his Christ is lining you up for alienation. Hence the Nicolaitans, I remembered myself.
There you go. That's right.
Right? And why should their gospel be gaining a foothold? I'm sure you talked about this, so I'll just be quick. Why should their gospel be gaining a foothold in Pergamum and Thyatira, thanks to the teacher whose name was surely not Jezebel? And maybe starting to make inroads in Ephesus, but the door was slammed in their face, because their gospel is the way to survive economically and socially in this world. We know that an idol is nothing. What's the problem with eating food sacrificed to idols, with showing up? We know that these gods are empty nothings. So why should we harm ourselves? Why should we become pariah in our city when there's no spiritual harm to be had there? And I think John's answer is the spiritual harm might not be to you, it's to everyone around you, to whom you are no longer witnessing to the one God and his claim on you. So there we
interesting. What if we were to jump down into the actual 7 messages of this to the 7 churches right now? When we look at this, you read the 7 messages and it seems as though each congregation has its own issue that it's dealing with. I mean, it's very specific. John is specific to that. But do you see that there's a main point that maybe John would want all the churches to know? Or is there maybe a primary issue confronting the churches? Or do you categorize them all as just being completely different?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I think there is one message that he has to each of the churches. Whatever you do tomorrow, make sure it will have Christ's approval and not Christ's censure, because that's what's going to count forever.
Mm.
And there are great promises
Mhm.
if you seek Christ's approval.
Right.
And there are heavy consequences if you neglect his warnings to walk in line with his witness.
Mhm.
So I think that's the frame for all of them. You know, this refrain, to the one who conquers, to the one who overcomes, which is an important, very important theme throughout Revelation. Overcoming is all about choosing the path that pleases Christ.
Would you summarize that? I like to say it this way and tell me if you would agree with it. That really the question at hand is, who is Lord? Is Jesus Lord or is Caesar Lord? To whom do you give your allegiance? As Nelson Crable's wonderful book was titled, right?
Yeah.
Allegiance and what is it? Allegiance and
Apocalypse and Allegiance.
Yeah.
A fabulous book.
Would you agree that that's a good way of summarizing the whole point at hand?
It is, although I might say that gives too much credits to the other side.
Okay.
Is Caesar Lord? It may not be the question on everyone's mind. You know, who counts more, Christ's opinion or my neighbor's?
Mm.
To whom do I owe greater loyalty, Christ or my patron?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever. So yes, I mean, is Jesus Lord or is Caesar? Yeah. But you know, who do I serve?
Right. Right. And then this brings in Matthew 6, right? Where why do you worry about food? Why do you worry about clothing? Because that really becomes kind of the nuts and bolts of it, is because if you don't give allegiance to your patron, then it's food and clothing. And Jesus is like, hey, look, you can't serve God and mammon.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
Excellent. Sure. Excellent.
So as the book of Revelation progresses, you, especially when you get into the later parts, you get into chapters 17 and 18, you start to see that it's not just the religious side of things. And we've already talked a lot through today and even through the series, how you can't really separate religion and politics. There's not a separation of church and state that exists. Everything is so entwined. It's a pot of spaghetti in terms of looking at everything. But you also start seeing aspects of material prosperity in Rome. And then it comes through the expense of human life. And I just brought up 17 and 18. I mean, you can go back to chapter 13 and the second beast, there's aspects of economics that you're already seeing there. Even in chapter 18, you have this kind of diminishing list of what they saw was important. And then you get to human souls at the very end. It starts with like costly cargo, and it finishes up at human souls. What does Roman prosperity look like, especially when it comes at the expense of others, especially, human beings?
Yeah, great question. Let's start right where you left us. Human souls, right? You might already have hit on this in earlier studies, but slavery was the backbone of the Greek economy and then the Roman economy after it. Estimates widely vary. I've seen everything from 10% of the population of the Roman Empire to 33% of the population of the Roman Empire. Even if you go with the lower end of that, that is still a lot of human beings being treated essentially like livestock to get the job done, so that those above that 10% can reap the profits of it. But I think 10% is way too low. I would tend toward a quarter to a third. I would tend more toward the higher estimate of things. But even aside from that, the subsistence level work of most agrarian workers throughout the empire is a difficult existence.
Right.
They're not at subsistence level because they're bad farmers and don't know what they're doing. They're at subsistence level because taxes and tribute might require a third of their crop. Or if they don't own their land, they're in even worse shape because they're also getting a share to the landowner who does. And so all of that produce that is simply passed on is pure profit for those who receive it, leaving just pure subsistence for those who have done the work. And that's the majority, the vast majority of people, like 90% of the population of the Mediterranean is involved in agrarian labor in the first century. And then, of course, Rome is always going to get her cut.
Right.
So the extraction of wealth from the provinces, That's always a reality of ancient empires. It was for Alexander, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies were particularly good at it, and and the Romans. I think of it as just a huge protection racket, essentially. You pay us protection money.
It's like the mob.
So that we don't destroy you.
Right.
We protect you from the enemies out there, but we don't destroy you ourselves. So all of this combines, I think. Oh, and one more factor, the one that John dwells on the most. There is tremendous profit to be made by a small slice of the local population by sending all the resources possible toward the center of the empire and toward the elites at the center of the empire. Hence, the merchants and the seafarers and sea captains have top billing in Revelation 18, that whole sort of trade and transportation industry that, in the words of one rich guy, Elias Aristides, toward the early 2nd century, can leave the provinces bare. He's talking about the wealth that he sees and the products that he sees available throughout the city of Rome itself. It's like, wow, it's like the trees of Arabia and India have been left bare so that all of the plenty could be gathered here. And I hope he's kind of tongue-in-cheek about it and not just that, totally unaware of the cost of empire. But all of that, I think, contributes to kind of the economic exploitation that John sees, names, and excoriates in Revelation 17 and 18.
Yeah.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determined Truth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel, is available on the Determined Truth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinedtruth.com website. Just click on the app tab.
I'm pretty sure that I got it from your work, Seeing Things John's Way, but I wrote some blogs on this during the pandemic. Is the COVID virus the third seal of the book of Revelation? Or I'm like, no, and I was talking about
not with a 1% mortality rate.
Really. I was talking about the third seal in particular, in terms of a quart of wheat for denarius, 3 quarts of barley for denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. And you mentioned, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, first, that Rome actually gave free grain so that people would move to Rome because they needed a population of people to work, the laborers, to take care of the well-to-do. And so they offered free grain for everyone that moved to Rome, and how that impacted the rest of the Roman Empire, especially if there's a famine elsewhere. Do you want to speak to that more clearly?
Well, I think you just did a marvelous job. So well done.
I kind of no. I think you can do it better. I hope I did a marvelous job.
That's essentially, you have 200,000 families living in the city of Rome on the dole. So grain is brought from Alexandria, Syria, Sicily, and other places by the bargeful to keep Rome's 200,000 families receiving at least a modicum of free sustenance. And that takes grain away from all of these provinces and from all of the mouths of the people in the provinces who are not protected by Rome's interests. Now, in a good year, nobody's starving. In a bad year, nobody in Rome and none of the elites in the provinces are going to be starving. But that's part of the fragility I was mentioning of life in these periods. And so Rome's appetite for everything from staples, as Vinnie pointed out earlier, staples like grain and olive oil and wine, to luxury items, their conspicuous consumption, and in many cases their hoarding of these items, simply left precious little for whole populations in the periphery.
All right, and I'll put a link to the blog that I wrote on in the show notes also. So, all right, so one of the things that I've been wrestling with a lot, and I think I'll be wrestling with a lot more now that I finished my commentary, and I think this is the next step, is kind of the U.S. We seem to have similarly benefited from stealing land, from the genocide of the indigenous people, which helps us with stealing land, and of course from slavery and free labor. In Seeing Things John's Way, you note that, quote, one cannot share in the profits of domination without also sharing in its crimes. That's page 47. And then on page 348, you note, one cannot profit from Babylon's partnership in violence and then expect a welcome in the New Jerusalem. Do you see a parallel there with kind of the United States and colonial enterprise that we've partaken of there? And if you want to speak to that, you can. If you don't want to speak to that, I understand.
I sense that there's really only one correct answer to your question.
I hope I didn't fair.
Of course. And this is one of the things that I think is a great gift that Revelation can give us. It can give us the courage to ask those questions about our own system, about our own history, and are we going to? Let me back up and start that this way. The people in Rome had a propagandistic story that they could buy into. It was announced in hymns of praise to Rome itself, worshipped as a goddess, to the emperors, celebrating the destiny of Rome, celebrating the achievements of Rome. How many coins from the first century have pax on the back, peace? How many have securitas on the back, security? And other symbols of just the benefits of empire. And with Revelation, John challenges a whole bunch of Gentile Christians to come out of that ideology. As more and more people join the Christian movement and are exposed to texts like this, they all have this opportunity to come out of the ideology that sustains exploitative practices that are themselves sustained ultimately by violence. You can't opt out of the empire, as Judea learned, to incredible harm in 70 CE. But individuals can opt out of believing the story as it's told, and maybe saying, is there more to the story that we need to pay attention to, so that we don't simply perpetuate its ills and enjoy the benefits that come from it, but begin to divest ourselves of the practices and the fruits of unjust practices, so we can be right with God. Because ultimately, we in Revelation's world, we want to stand before God's judgment throne and be found righteous and holy, not to be found to have lived in flagrant violation of the commandments of God and the warnings of the prophets that John kind of regurgitates and renovates throughout Revelation, but especially in chapter 18 on this very subject. So yes, we have that opportunity to do as you're doing, as a colleague of mine, Dan Hawk, has done for, I want to say, a decade and a half, in regard to the untold history of indigenous peoples in America, and building bridges again between Christian churches and Native American Christians, with a view to acknowledgement, lament, reconciliation, and repair. It's a great work. It's a very important work.
Just everything we've been talking about for the last few minutes is so highly applicational in the modern world. And I'm thinking back, even right, like as I reflect in the last 2 minutes of hearing you speak, David, like instantly I'm making connections in terms of what application could look like for today. It's funny because it's actually reminding me of the first time I read the Unholy Allegiances book that you wrote. I was familiar with Revelation itself, and I hadn't done all the background work. And so just reading that text alone, just by being from, you're not, it's not written as a normal commentary where you're exegeting all the passages. You're just giving background on Rome, but you're doing the relevant stuff to Revelation. And I remember reading it saying like, oh my gosh, I'm making connections to Revelation without it having to be a commentary, if this makes sense. And so
it does. Thank you.
Yeah, no. And I always recommend this, in our local church, when I teach hermeneutics classes, that's always one of the resources I put on there in terms of for Revelation, like read this book. It's a great book. Lay people could get it. The seminarian's going to glean from it. A fantastic work. But even as I'm hearing you now, it's like, okay, I'm making connections for what application can look like for the ethic of how we view people, how we view goods, how this plays out. If you were to, though, teach without having to infer that, if you were to then teach or preach a sermon on this, what are the types of things that you would specifically push on and specifically create those bridges from Revelation to modern American culture?
Wow.
In regard with the aspect of economics and, you know, how that might work with idolatry and worship, and, you know, just ways that we could actually play, you know, live this out.
Okay. So I'm not sure that Revelation itself has a great deal of, say, practical advice in regards to living this out, but it does very clearly establish a frame. There is one who sits upon the throne, and there's only one. We all live under his reign, and we're either living obediently and faithfully, or we're living rebelliously. So are we living obediently? Are we honoring the reign of God and of his Messiah, of his Christ? So I think one of the things I would push on would be, are we building our economic practices? Are we building our social practices? And by we, I mean those of us who claim Christ, not our society or anything like that, but are we building our own social and economic practices on Jesus' commandments and instructions? Very simply. Because if we are, we're doing what our Lord tells us, which Jesus seemed to think was important. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I tell you?
Just to ask a clarifying question, because first off, you're addressing this to the people of God. You're
Right.
All right. You're almost I'm wondering, are you assuming that Rome is going to act like Rome? So don't be surprised that they do this sort of thing. Babylon's going to be Babylon. America is going to be America. You know, whoever is going to be what they are. So people of God, what do you look like when you're establishing your practice? So that's, you know, it's not just criticizing the world, although there is a criticism for the world.
Exactly. And maybe, you know, my own leanings are a little bit too standoffish in terms of reforming society. But I have this sense that if the 2 billion Christians alive on the planet today were fully committed simply to living together in line with God's commandments and Jesus' instructions, that would be a world transforming witness in itself, without us ever, you know, storming Washington and saying it has to be done this way or anything, you know, just ridiculously political like that. And so, you know, I think many of my friends and parishioners, they lose a lot of time and energy talking about what should happen in politics. And if we just put that energy together into coming out of the Babylonish practices of our own country and figuring out how to really build our lives on the foundation of Jesus' instructions, that would be transformative for us, for anyone who witnesses it, for those who join us, who come out also and join us, remembering that we are just, you know, a small part of a kingdom made up from people of every nation and tribe and language group, and all of us doing this together. That would be the greatest political transformation of the world, possibly. I mean, that is the reign of God coming into reality in our sphere, where those of us who call Jesus Lord live that way. That's really vague and general, I know, but it's not like you're paying me for this, so you get what you get, right?
Wow, there you go.
That was solid. I don't know if that was passive aggressive or brilliant. That was great.
It's not, I don't think anyone's getting paid for this, but excellent. The question of wealth and material prosperity and things of that nature, I think that the question at hand, right, is, and tell me what you think of this, is whether or not, it's not a question of whether one can be wealthy or not. It's whether or not the question of wealth was gained at the expense of somebody else or not. Would you say it that way?
I think that's fair.
Okay.
I think it's difficult in the systems of the world, as they were in the first century, and frankly, as they are in the 21st century, for great wealth to be gathered not at somebody else's expense at some point. Now, I'm no economist,
Right.
but I just have this sense that so I'm going to kind of expose myself to being canceled here, I guess, by some members of your audience. But the vision of capitalism may not be compatible with Jesus' vision for wealth,
Right.
because wealth that is piled up is the treasure that is lost. Wealth that is invested in other people, especially to relieve their need, is the treasure that is kept forever. So on the one hand, just the amassing of wealth, I think, is problematic for us who call Jesus Lord. And the other side of it is, where is there really wealth that is untainted? So that may be too cynical. Maybe
No,
it's
no,
out
I think
there.
it's certainly the case in Revelation, in Luke 17, Luke 18, right? It's like, how'd you get your wealth, oh rich young ruler? What are you doing with it, right? And I've kept all the commands. Oh, okay, have you? Right? Exactly. And then of course we meet Zacchaeus in Luke 19, and he realized, oh, wait a minute, I have done this. Yeah. So
Zacchaeus, he lost his whole nest egg when he came to faith, and he realized, I have put piling up money ahead of my relationships with my fellow Israelites. I've traded their goodwill and their well-being for my own personal wealth. I've got to reverse that. Yeah.
This is a challenging question, I think, for the American Christian. Now, your statement about capitalism doesn't mean that you're a socialist or you're a communist. The point of that is, I think any secular economic system is going to have its flaws. And
That's right. There isn't a pure one.
Right. Exactly.
That's the nature of domination.
And there isn't a Christian one per se either, because obviously we're comprised of people from all nations. Okay. But now you have, in the first century world, and I think this is why this is not addressed so explicitly, like the American contemporary context is not addressed as explicitly, is because in the first century context, you lived with your family. The kids, the idea of honor your father and mother is the fact that when they get old, you care for them and they live on the same land. Now, of course, my kids live in DC. I'm living in Sacramento with my grandson. I'm not bitter about that, but that's okay. We'll get over that some other time. But, and then, another kid here in Phoenix, and my daughter here at home, and so all of a sudden now we have to have this 401k. We have to have this retirement system. We have to have this security in place so that when we retire, whatever that might mean. And so Americans we're prone to save for that retirement, but I think we would stop and go, okay, yeah, but do we have too much as it is? Do we have too much now? And therefore what I'm retiring for is, and the nest egg I need for that is to sustain a level of existence that I don't need to sustain. And so how do we address this in a contemporary setting then, when it's about accumulation for the sake of retirement, about accumulation for the sake of provision? You know what I'm getting at there?
Yeah. And I think and I don't think there's actually a solution to this.
Okay, good. Yeah.
But I think one of the huge problems is that our idea of church has drifted so far from Jesus' idea of the family of his followers. It has not proven true that those who have left father and mother and brother and sister and child and house and field for his sake and for the sake of the gospel have found all of those things 100-fold, because we do not provide that for one another.
Wow, that's a good point.
Huge failure. And think about how much freer we could be with wealth to relieve present need now.
Right.
If we had created a church culture where we really were committed to one another and to sustaining one another's needs between now and our transition to eternity. But we don't have that family. You're right about the natural families kind of disintegration is the wrong word. What's the word? Kind of just being spread out all over the place.
I think disintegration is not,
Yeah.
not a bad
Okay.
word. Yeah,
But
no, I
but
get
we
you,
haven't replaced that
in
with
the church.
church's vision for church as a family that is every bit as strong as a natural family.
Yeah, and then because there's been so much church misappropriation of funds, of resources, or whatever, that people don't even trust the church to do that any longer either, right?
Well, yes, and I suppose I'm not thinking about church as institutions so much as church as other Christians.
Okay, community. All right, yeah, local community.
Yeah,
I'm thinking of church as local community, though.
Yeah, local
okay,
community
yeah.
is perfect.
Okay.
But we're still, we draw our boundaries around our nuclear family, our private space, and what have you. I think we will not realize our potential as people of God in this world until we recover that ideal that Jesus and Paul both strove for in Christian communities.
Hey, one more major topic is the question of violence. This is big in scholarship today. I think you might know Tripper Longman wrote a commentary recently on the Old Testament eyes, looking at the book of Rhetoric through Old Testament eyes. And he was big on this, like, it's a violent text. It's a violent text. It's a violent text. I understand why. Vinnie and I have discussed this before. I know Tripper. I don't think it's a violent text. I think the violence is the violence that the nations are doing because God's allowing the nations to continue to exist out of his love and out of his grace. I think that the New Testament tells us that we need to reread and how we understand violence. And that in the kingdom of God, violence is manifested in loving our enemies and suffering of violence. What are your thoughts on this kind of as a whole? I know obviously you haven't read my commentary yet and where I take it through all the way through. But
hey, Vinnie, you noticed he said yet.
Yeah,
I heard the yet there.
I got that.
Well, of course, yeah, that's right. So
he'll send you a copy.
Nothing wrong with that, of course, right?
So, I hate to be contrary,
No,
but as I read Revelation, I walk away thinking, dang, that's a violent text.
Okay. Now, and when you say that, you mean that's a violent text with God inflicting the violence, or that a violent text in terms of there's violence within the text? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah, as I sit here today,
okay,
and I can't always be convinced otherwise, I suppose, but as I sit here today, I see Revelation using the language of violence.
Yes, I do too. Okay,
in order to express vividly the wrath of God against his rebellious creatures who have done evil to one another.
Yeah.
All that stuff that we just talked about in Revelation 17 and 18, who have perpetrated blasphemies against God in their self-glorifying ideologies, going back to Revelation 13, what have you. But darn it all, if God doesn't have an arsenal that makes them all look like they're shooting cork guns.
Now, I would agree, by the way, that in the end, there's no doubt that there's ultimate justice and there's divine violence at the end. I'm talking about in the present day, as in the interim. What we'll do is we'll do this. You read my commentary, we'll have you back on, and then we'll discuss it then.
All right, there we go. There we go.
Excellent. Vinnie, any other things that you have?
No, that's just been fascinating. And I actually made this point in a class I was teaching at the local in my church this weekend, where oftentimes, and this is actually something more applicable for the lay person, at the lay level, we read our people. We oftentimes, depending on the tradition you come from, you have your scholars that your tradition might latch onto. And so in my context, I'm in a Reformed Baptist context. So we're going to have like our people who we just tend to read. And in a Methodist tradition, you're going to have, David, you would be part of that tradition. And so like my people aren't going to be reading generally David deSilva and Mike Gorman, but Methodists are, and we all have our people. And the point I was made is we oftentimes fight at the lay level where we have theological disagreements. And the point I was making to my people that I was teaching was, when I'm able to hang out with scholars who are, they're kind of leading the charge, they're helping us in this level. They have disagreements, but it's done so charitably and thoughtfully in terms of taking one another's thoughts seriously and wrestling with it. And just the fact that, like, if we weren't meeting over Zoom right now, and if we were in the same area, like, we could gladly go out and share a coffee or lunch or something right now. And I always appreciate
Notice
that.
He didn't say a beer or something like that because he's Baptist.
Because I'm Baptist. So we can't do that. We're not allowed to, because then divine judgment would come on me. But no, that's just one of the things, kind of like in the mind of me, which isn't like relevant to Revelation itself, but as the layperson in the conversation right now, and knowing that we have a lot of lay people listening, it's just like, man, this is something that we need to pay attention to, that when we're having these conversations, there is a charity there that exists, that I just think needs to be modeled more in the church. And that's just something I always just appreciate. So kind of an off topic thing, but it's just,
but a very important note, especially in 2023.
Yes.
We have become so uncharitable.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Vinnie. It's so important, because now we see through a glass darkly. Right,
and we shall see face to face.
So we have to hold our opinions and our positions a little bit lightly, with just enough humility to listen to one another charitably.
Yes.
If that's gone, we've forgotten our limitations.
Yeah. Well, and I would say the thing that unites us is in this Venn diagram of different beliefs. That center of the Venn diagram is saying, okay, who do you have allegiance towards? Okay, is it Caesar or Christ? And we would absolutely land there. And then as well, you would say, and we are united in Christ. We're not united by how we might interpret some of these other things. And it's not like, that's not just a way to wash away the differences, because those are significant things that we want to wrestle through. But it's just like, no, there's something greater there. And that's the thing we need to find our unity in. So, and especially in a text like Revelation. And Rob, this isn't something that we've really, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent on this one, but is there any more divisive book in the Bible than Revelation?
Romans, technically.
I was going to say Romans. Yeah, I was going to say maybe Romans. But man, like, where do you find your unity? And if you have union in Christ, then we could be okay with these other things. It's all right.
Amen. So. David, a question to you then. Anything that you wanted to throw out that we hadn't covered yet, or what you were hoping that we would ask you about?
No, I do want to return to the violence thing, because I think we cut that short, and it is important.
Okay, good.
And so maybe one thing to walk away from is that none of the violence that happens in Revelation is perpetrated by Christ followers. That's a given, right? We all know that if we read the book carefully. We do not participate in violence at any point, even at the end. Right. It is only Christ with the word of his mouth. Right. That deals with the enemies. I think that's really important. And the path that is very clearly laid out for Christ followers in Revelation is to bear witness. Yes. To live obediently and to bear witness in the face of whatever cost that incurs. Now there's a paradigm that's quite challenging in 2023, especially in America. I don't know that that's a paradigm that's been tried in a small town. Nope. Did I go there? but really this idea that, I am not going to perpetrate violence. Right. And how do we take seriously the call to follow a Lord who allowed himself to be slain? Right. Rather than who slaughtered, like other lords. Like and that's my point. Augustus, like Caesar. That's my point when I'm talking about violence. Okay, excellent. Right? Well, that's an excellent point. Okay, good. Is that we are called to follow the Lamb, and we imitate Christ. And because he is the Lamb and not the lion, right? The word lion is applied to Jesus only once, but the word lamb is applied to Jesus 27 times in the book. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so John prefers lamb. And I don't remember what author it was. It might have been G.B. Carrott, who talks about lion power versus lamb power. And that distinction there, and I think that's phenomenal, and that's what we're supposed to do. So if we're to emulate God, and our God is not a violent God, then I think that it makes it easier to kind of throw that out there. But anyways, all right, thank you. All right, hey, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Vinnie. It's been great to be with you all. All right. Absolutely. Thanks for spending time with us, David. Hope everyone appreciates this. Check out the show notes, because we will definitely link relevant works of David. And David, was there any other way that you wanted to promote in terms of how people engage with you? Are you present on social media? Do you have a blog? Honestly, I'm a bit of a cave dweller. I may have tweeted twice in my life. Although I'm learning that might not be a thing much longer anyway. Yeah, exactly. check Amazon.com occasionally.
Okay.
There you go.
There might be something new. That's it.
Excellent.
Awesome. Well, we will look in the show notes. And like I said, regarding Revelation, the Unholy Allegiance, fantastic work.
Yeah.
Rob, you went through David's work on Revelation itself. Would you say that that's applicable for a layperson? Or
Yeah, Unholy Allegiance is certainly the one that's most accessible to, I think, the layperson. Would you agree, David?
I would, yeah.
Yeah.
That started off as lectures for church groups.
Okay.
With a whole bunch of slides that made it into the book as photos. So, yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Hey, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, everyone. Catch you guys next time. I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.